mythologies, folklore, all of these kinds of things, which can grab your imagination, can also help guide you, therefore, toward meaning.
Mhm.
If you accept the sort of world I grew up in, which was all about, theoretically at least, all about science and such, there's no meaning to be found there.
Mhm.
All there are facts. And fact and meaning are two totally different things.
Stay tuned for the show. Poets at War is sponsored by the following.
Hello, I'm Sarah Levesque, Editor-in-Chief of Logo Sophia magazine. I would like to invite you to explore our Pilgrim's Journal of Life, Love, and Literature, both in visual format and in podcast format. Our goal is to help bridge the gaps between different Christian denominations and traditions. Please visit our website at logosophiamag.com to read or listen to stories, articles, poetry, and more, all for free. We look forward to journeying with you.
Welcome to the trenches, soldier. We are joined today by General Glenn Sunshine to speak about the Dark Ages, history, meaning, folklore, and mythology. Join us, won't you? The battle has just begun. This is Poets at War.
God of song, said the warrior bard, though all the world betray thee, one sword at least thy right shall guard, one faithful harp shall praise thee.
To ask you on to talk about the Dark Ages. I think many in our circles kind of have a better understanding, sort of what they were and what was at least a little bit more reverence for what was going on during that time, as opposed to, what a lot of Enlightenment type thinking folk tend to bring up. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit more in depth on sort of a realistic understanding and realistic view of what the Dark Ages actually meant, where we are now, etc., and were they actually dark? So I guess just wherever you want to start, and then I can just kind of ask questions from there, I suppose.
Okay. Well, as soon as you start using a phrase like the Dark Ages, we've got a basic problem of definition. What do you mean?
Right.
If you're an American, what you mean is this sort of whole vaguely defined period between the Roman Empire and Queen Elizabeth or something.
Right.
That Elizabeth I, that was ignorant and backward and so on. If you are British and you use the term Dark Ages, you mean something completely different.
Right.
What you mean is a period known as the early Middle Ages, the period from, call it roughly 500 to 1,000 in round numbers. And when they use the word Dark Ages, it's not a value judgment the way it is in America. The way they use it is, this is a period we don't have a lot of written records for, and so we can't see into it as well as we can into other areas. In other words, it's historically dark. We can't see it. So you've got to be careful. If you're reading a British author, that's what they mean by the term. In America, we'd use the term something like late antiquity, early Middle Ages, or something like that.
Would you say that all of Europe is generally that way when referring to the Dark Ages, or particularly just Britain?
Well, as soon as you use the term Dark Ages, you're using an English phrase.
Right.
So
fair enough. I was saying Irish in particular and whatever else, but yeah, I guess they were more connected with that when the area we're talking about as far as Enlightenment and whatnot. So go ahead.
Yeah. So, but even there, lately, the amount that we know about the early Middle Ages has been growing by quite a bit, largely because of work in something known as the New Archaeology and other sources. We're finding that a lot of the things that we thought we knew about the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, may not really be accurate. I mean, the jury's still out on some of this stuff, but it seems like even that the early Middle Ages, which is generally considered a time of retrenchment, even that may not have been quite what we think it was. We're seeing evidence, for example, of trading sites known generally as wicks, some of which seem to have been incredibly huge, much more so than our written records would suggest they should have been. So the archaeology seems to be bearing this out as well. And the very existence of these places as trading centers indicates that there was a lot of trade going on across Northern Europe and beyond. One of the more intriguing finds was at a place called Tintagel. Tintagel is in Cornwall. It is the legendary place of King Arthur's birth. And people were saying for years how ridiculous this was because the castle at Tintagel wasn't built until the 1200s, if I remember right. This is 700 years after Arthur was alive. Well, the problem, maybe 800. The problem is they've just recently discovered it looks like a capital city at the site of Tintagel, dating back to the period of Arthur's life. And what you find there is evidence that the people who lived at Tintagel were trading with Gaul, modern-day France, with Italy, with Greece, with Turkey, modern Turkey. They're finding wares from all of these different areas at the site, which indicates, number one, it was really wealthy. Number two, it was really well connected. But nobody even knew this existed until
of course.
just a few years ago when the archaeologists started excavating a little bit away from the castle and found this.
That's fascinating to begin with. Yeah, I've heard a lot of scholarly stuff, back and forth on Arthur over the years, and one of the big ones I've heard that I'm not sure I 100% believe, but I feel like if you're there's all the conglomeration of this, a little bit of that, whatever, and I want to hear what your thoughts are on Arthur, but one of the ones that I've seen, the only one that still doesn't fully add up that I give any credence to these days is that even if it wasn't him, he had some impact one way or another, or Arthur to Alfred or Alfred to Arthur, but Alfred is one of those ones that I look at and I go, there's some kind of connection there. I don't know what, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, Alfred is very definitely historical.
Arthur.
Well, first of all, king is wrong.
Right.
Arthur was not a king. He was basically a warlord. I believe he really existed. And the general pattern of him trying to resist Saxon invasions is probably correct. He was most likely a Romano-Briton, a Romanized Celt, native of Britain. And if you go to the Welsh tradition in the Welsh Bardic triads, these are within the Bardic tradition, they group things in three. It's a very Celtic thing to do.
Yep.
And they talk about, they use the phrase red reavers. A red reaver is a guy who's really good at slaughter. Okay, it's really what it comes down to.
Right.
And it says, there were 3 red reavers, and it names them. And then it says, but the reddest red reaver of all was Arthur. And this is probably, it's an oral tradition, so we can't date it, but I suspect this may be the oldest reference we have to Arthur that's preserved in this Bardic triad. So he seems to have been a very effective war leader. And the story grows from there, is my best guess.
Yeah.
He may have been one of the Celts, Romano-Britons that were resisting the Saxon invasions, which is exactly where the legend places them, and where the Bardic triad most likely dates to roughly that period.
I gotcha. Yeah, I think the things that have been coming out about Dark Ages, I see bits and pieces here or there, and it's hard to place it all together unless you're really studying a lot of this kind of stuff. The 3 areas that I find most fascinating that I'm seeing stuff come out of is the connections that we have between Europe and Africa. that are starting to show up in random places and random ways. This seems to be a lot more robust than we previously thought. The connections between Brendan, further on, and the Americas, and then the other is just, and if I'm pronouncing it wrong, please forgive me. I've never heard it pronounced, Del Riata, the Scottish side of things. A lot of my ancestors were, as far as I can trace them, Gauls that eventually moved in and were involved in the formation of Del Riata, and all that situation. So I don't know if you want to speak to any of those specifically. I know about there's some places all over the United States that may have Welsh connections, random things here or there. Different people dispute one thing or another. You can crush any of those if you want to crush those.
Okay.
If they're totally out, way out there. There's Gaelic stuff in various places, Gallic stuff. But yeah, just anything, Africa, America, how it connects, how Europe connected to the whole world, and it seems in many cases during the early Middle Ages.
Okay, well, first, the Roman Empire had a very tight integrated market economy. Different regions specialized in different things. They did a lot of internal trade, but the empire was really centered around the Mediterranean basin. Until there's an argument by a historian, wrote this up probably in the 1920s, by the name of Henri Pirenne, who argues that the Mediterranean world continued to function rather well, actually, until the expansion of Islam. And it's the expansion of Islam that really cut Europe off from the southern Mediterranean. I wouldn't go as far as Pirenne does. I don't think Pirenne is one of these guys that, as a historian, one of my dreams would be to be as wrong as he is. because nobody really accepts the Pirenne thesis completely, but bits and pieces of it keep getting resurrected.
Right.
He was extraordinarily influential. And I think he exaggerates the situation here, but it is clear that the expansion of Islam does break up a kind of unity, at least within the Mediterranean basin. That much is clear.
Right.
Prior to that, contacts with Africa, particularly if you're thinking Egypt, were very clear. And in fact, the early Irish church was heavily influenced by Egyptian models of monasticism. So there is a clear connection at that point. When you move to Brendan, I think, well, in the 1970s, Tim Severin proved that you could make it from Ireland to North America in a curragh.
Right.
Personally, I think he was crazy, but he did it. And yeah, I think it is likely that Brendan did make it across the North Atlantic, make it probably to Newfoundland, possibly down the coast. I mean, and just imagine, what he was doing was trying to find the promised land of the saints.
Right.
So imagine if you're in medieval Ireland and you make it across the North Atlantic and you're going down the Atlantic coast and you find yourself in the Caribbean. That could look a lot like paradise to you.
Yeah.
And the curious thing is that if you pick up the Gulf Stream, it will take you straight back to Ireland.
That's amazing.
I know a guy who did it in a sailboat. It will take you straight to Ireland. So it's quite possible that Brendan did, in fact, make it across the North Atlantic. We know it can be done. And that whether he made it to the Caribbean or not, that's just sort of my own fantasy there.
Right.
But whether he made it there or not, making it back across the Atlantic is also quite possible given the way the Gulf Stream flows. So I think Brendan probably did do that. We know, by the way, that Christopher Columbus was very familiar with the legend of St. Brendan.
Right.
He probably figured Brendan made it to Japan. But, one way or
Whoops,
another.
sorry. I'm so sorry. I was trying to look something up and my speakers were on. Go ahead.
Okay. One way or another, we know that the Navigatio, the voyage of Brendan, was one of the most famous legends in the Middle Ages. I mean, it was very, very widely known. Now, if you read the Navigatio, it's obvious that it is highly embroidered. And this brings up another kind of interesting point. What you see in the Navigatio is what is technically called an Imran. An Imran is a kind of a saga or legend about heroes voyaging out in the ocean, the adventures of these people out in the ocean. And Brendan is clearly, the Navigatio is clearly a Christianized Imran. It takes all of the characteristics of an Imran, but puts them in Christian terms so that rather than dealing with pagan gods and goddesses or whatever, you're dealing with an island that has monks on it, or you've got an island of sentient birds who are worshipers of God or whatever. You can actually identify where most of these islands are. So the island of birds would be in the Faroes, for example. So it's taking, this is another interesting characteristic of the period. They're taking a pagan story form and baptizing it and turning it into a Christian story. And people would have understood the rules for this. They'd have understood that this is in a sense a tall tale, but in another sense it's connected to a real person. And okay, it's exaggerated and there are all kinds of allegorical elements added to it, but this was real. This really happened. So
yeah, that's great. And we can go further with that if that's where you want to go. One other person I wanted to bring up that I was just looking up, and this is a little bit later, but Madoc, Prince Madoc. Are you familiar with the Welsh prince?
No.
1100s. He was a seafaring guy, and there's connections between him and what some people say geologically are rock formations, others say are ruins in the Kentucky, Ohio area of all places.
I thought you were going to go to the one in New Hampshire.
I was going to go. Well, I know the one. The two main places that I know of are this one, the Devil's Backbone, in the Kentucky, Ohio border, which is part of a park. And it's a very if it is a rock formation, it's incredibly symmetrical. And then the other is in West Virginia. There are some caves. Do you know about the West Virginia one or no?
No.
Okay, there's a West Virginia one that the guy who discovered it and has taken pictures of it and documented it is a hobby historian, and that's where a lot of people, they attack him versus what he's saying. But he's academically he's a dentist, but he found these. He had some friends who had some. Oh yeah, it's the Native American carvings. They've been there forever. We don't know how old they are, whatever. You want to come look at them? Sure. This happened back in the 80s, I want to say, was the main thing. It's still on private land. Apparently, some people go there on occasion, but they've kind of, the people who own it kind of shut it off after a little while. But there are carvings that are Ogham in the cave.
It's just pronounced Ohm, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
It looks like Ogham, but it's just pronounced Ohm.
Right. Okay. You're right. I knew that, but I forgot.
Yeah.
Anyway,
easy to make.
I see it more than I hear it.
Right.
It's one of those things. But yeah, so they found those, and a lot of people think it was Brendan. Why he got all the way to West Virginia inland. If that is the case, I don't know, but it's fascinating. And the guy who found them, his rough translation, his rough translating of it and trying to figure it out, he believes it's an account of the Christmas story. And there are some lights that are some holes for lights that are carved into this cave. They may not be carved, they may just be holes, but it appears that they're brightest in this cave, this tiny outcropping cave, whatever, during the late December season. So there's some interest there, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and there's another one that that has been dubbed America's Stonehenge in New Hampshire, and that one has its own series of maybe it's Celts, maybe it's Vikings, maybe it's the Knights Templar. There's all kinds of speculation, but there's little evidence to really go on to make a firm conclusion.
Right.
The problem with the Ogham alphabet is that it's a series of vertical slashes for all practical purposes. And distinguishing that from a scratch or something along those lines is a little bit on the tricky side. Right. So you have to be careful in terms of trying to decipher those, number one. But number two, especially when you're in an area in which there isn't a clear Irish presence, figuring out whether you're really dealing with Ogham writing or not is a whole different and difficult question.
Right.
So I'm agnostic in terms of the Celts arriving over here. It's, is it possible? Yeah, of course it's possible. The Vikings certainly did. Brendan probably did. There's no reason why others couldn't have made it as well. But the evidence isn't as strong as I would like to be able to say anything definitive on that.
So
as far as Dalriada goes, by the way, going back to Scotland, one of the key people you've got to deal with there is Saint Columba, who has his own terribly interesting history or legend. Not entirely sure which. Columba was a fellow student with Brendan of St. Finian, who taught the 12 Apostles of Ireland, as they're known, which include both Brendan and Columba, and several others. One way or another, like I said, the legends, we're not entirely sure how much of it is real and how much of it is legend. But Columba sailed across from Ireland and established a monastery at the island of Iona. And from Iona, he proceeded to evangelize Scotland. And from there, his followers would push into northern England. So he's a terribly important guy. And as a matter of fact, the monks in Iona are also the people who originated the Celtic cross that we see around today, which itself has its own really interesting set of symbolism attached to it that most people don't really get.
Yeah. And this is all not even getting into this is the crazy thing to me, trying to trace as best as we can, and make educated guesses where we can't, get 100%, but we try our best and say this is legend, this is, and we categorize those things. But I can't help but try and look at all the amazing lines, even in other people's genealogies they've found, stuff that I find. And I'm fascinated when I do genealogy work just for myself and my family, like regardless of whether it's true or not, even if it was just this guy really loved this guy and didn't know who his dad was, so he wanted to say that this guy was his dad. Like, that's a family story, that's something that is not nothing, it's at least a family story that's fascinating. And I think that we've had so much crammed down our throats over the course of the 20th century in particular, where we say there isn't ever any kind of connection. It's always it's God doesn't work in mysterious ways. He works in obvious and blatant direct ways if we believe in God in the first place, right? and this is one of those things where I want to know, I want to talk to folks like you, and I want to get to the root of it, but I'm actually far more interested, I think, in the end, in what kind of foundations do we have folklorically that we haven't been told, even if they're legend, right? what were the things that our ancestors knew or were fascinated by? What were their stories? What were their, kinds of things? Because those shaped the way people thought.
Well, let me give you a really good example. This comes from a book called The Tree of Salvation. Subtitle Yggdrasil and the Cross in the North, by a Jesuit. I'm blanking out on his name.
Okay.
In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil is the world tree. It's the tree that unites all the different parts of the world. The roots are in the underworld, the branches are in the heavens, and Middle Earth runs between them. And Yggdrasil goes through it, and it basically ties everything together. Yggdrasil is alternatively described as an ash or an evergreen, and it performs a lot of different functions in Norse mythology. Its roots are in the underworld by the well that gives you wisdom. Odin was hung on Yggdrasil for 3 days so that he could get access to the water of that well. And at Ragnarok, at the end of the world, Yggdrasil is going to open up and take into it a couple of the young gods and a couple of human beings and close up, so that as the world ends in this huge disaster, Yggdrasil will then open up and they will come out and start the world anew. All of these are parts of the mythology surrounding Yggdrasil. When Christianity came to the Norse, they adapted the story of Yggdrasil not as literal history, but as a picture of the gospel. What they said was Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, Ragnarok has already happened.
Yes.
The cross is Yggdrasil. The cross is the tree of life. The cross is the thing which opens up and brings us into the new heavens and new earth. It is the route to eternal life. And you see this in the iconography that shows up in churches, in the stave churches, and the very way they are constructed. All of this is to point people to Yggdrasil, and through Yggdrasil to the cross, and through the cross to the message that the old gods are gone. And the new world is here through Christ.
Yeah, that's something that I see across a lot of different cultures. We see it in the Chinese language. That's one thing that I've read from a book, at Discovering Genesis in the Chinese language, something like that. I think you might know that book. And then there's just all these different things. And the thing that always fascinated me, I'm like, okay, well, where's the connection in the Bible? That was the thing that I had growing up with this stuff. I'm like, I can see all these connections. I can see how they use this here or there. And I went through a period where I was really questioning my own faith. It was pretty young, and everything. But my question was really just, this was the question being posed to me. Why do you need a Jewish backwoods savior? Right? Why do you need this little guy over here in the corner? What does he have to do with people who believed in Yggdrasil and Odin and whatever else? And the thing that I ultimately got back to is two things from Scripture. One, Hebrews, talking about types and shadows, talking about how God used all kinds of types and shadows throughout history. How Melchizedek, was the priest before the Levitical order. That was a Noahic connection, whatever it was. He was connected to Noah in some way. And then the other is back in Noah, his sons, the promise made to Japheth. A lot of people skip over it and just talk about this promise to Shem, but that Japheth would be a many people and he would dwell in the tents of Shem. I like to see how, especially after the resurrection, but before too, how God, in a very broad and amazing sense, has fulfilled and is fulfilling his promise of Japheth, the nations dwelling in the tents of Shem, the Gentiles, so that's amazing to me.
Well, one of the things that Lewis and Tolkien both believed very firmly is that mythologies were ways in which God revealed truth to the pagans.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't scripture, it wasn't truth at that level, but he gave them hints and pictures of what would be accomplished in Christ.
Right.
And thus it is possible to, well, redeem paganism. It is possible. The pagan societies, especially the northern ones to Tolkien and Lewis, had tremendous virtues. They also had tremendous evil in them.
Yes.
So what was needed was a Christianization of the culture such that the evils that they were given to were brought under control, but the virtues that they advocated were promoted. And as they looked at their own society, they saw that these strong northern virtues were seriously lacking, which I think is one of the reasons why. I mean, you read, if you understand the concept of northernness, as I think that was Tolkien's word for it, if you understand that, you understand the virtues, and then you read The Abolition of Man, what you discover is that we're completely lacking those virtues of northern culture. Now, for Lewis and Tolkien, that they went north because that was where their imagination took them.
Right.
We could say the same thing about any other culture. There are great virtues in it, but there's also great evil, and we need to purge the evil and preserve the good and promote the good. For Lewis and Tolkien, that was focused on the north, but it doesn't have to be the north.
That's actually one of the reasons, this is getting away from Dark Ages, and that's fine. We can do that, which is just a conversation. But this is why, for all the absolute crazy faults of our culture, I'm thinking particularly of millennial Christians. I'm not even necessarily even thinking of the pagan side of what we're dealing with now, but like there's so much bad that's happened and has been blamed and laid at the feet of my generation and Gen Z by a lot of folks, and the Disney generation, that sort of a thing. And I have found that the one really good thing about my generation and the generation ahead of us, so to speak, is that there was a lot of, and this is just my thoughts, but the generation previous to us and the generation previous to that kind of bought in full hook, line, and sinker to a corporate mentality of a crony capitalism mentality of a lot of things. And I'm not talking Marxism. I'm not saying anything on that.
No.
But yeah, they bought in. They said, oh yeah, I'll take that job. I'll live in the suburban house, whatever. And one of the things that the Disney generation, so to speak, the people who've said follow your heart, go live the van life, all that other kind of thing that they do. The one good thing in that is that they are saying there's more. There's something transcendent. We don't know what it is because y'all didn't tell us, but we're going to go find it. And that tends to come. There was a little bit of that with the hippies. There was a little bit, that comes and goes in generations. But it's fascinating to me. And that's been a big part of my ministry to people my age. I want to say to them, yeah, we got our systematic theologies, and then we've got this kind of stuff that we're talking about. And God speaks in all of it. And we need to be searching through all of it and experiencing all of it because he gave it to us as a gift.
I think it was C.S. Lewis who said that the intellect is the organ of understanding, but the imagination is the organ of meaning.
Yes.
And I have been really focused around the issue of meaning for quite a while. I think that that's really one of these things that's sort of critically important. And mythologies, folklore, all of these kinds of things, which can grab your imagination, can also help guide you, therefore, toward meaning. if you accept the sort of world I grew up in, which was all about, theoretically at least, all about science and such, there's no meaning to be found there.
Mm-hmm.
All there are facts, and fact and meaning are two totally different things. I've increasingly come to believe that with the medievals, we'll get back to the medievals here, with the medievals, we need to recognize that the physical world, everything around us, points beyond itself to spiritual truth and ultimately to its maker.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're someone living in the Middle Ages, C.S. Lewis in the Discarded Image, he says, if you were to bring a medieval man forward, the thing he would be most impressed with is, well, Noah's day, it was the card catalog. It would be database here because everything is organized, everything is orderly. And that's the way medievals thought. They believed the world should be organized, it should be orderly, place for everything, everything in its place, everything full, all of these kinds of things. But what Lewis doesn't say is that if you brought a medieval person forward and asked him what he thought of our world, my best bet is what he would say is, it's really impressive how much you guys know, but you understand nothing.
Mm. Yeah.
Let me give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
A Gothic cathedral, particularly we'll do with French Gothic because it has some characteristics that you don't see in some of the others. In order to set the orientation of the nave, the main body of the church, the bishop would stand holding his crozier up, his staff, at sunrise on Easter. And the shadow of the crozier would then give him the east-west axis of the church. Is it exactly east? No. Does that matter? No. Because it's not about the literal. They then construct the nave of the church. They put in the transepts, which are the cross pieces that make the church cruciform. The altar is always at the east. And the main portal, typically called the royal portal, is on the west. And then there are other portals through the doors on the transepts. Why is the altar always on the east? Well, symbolically, the east is toward Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And when Solomon dedicated the temple, he said in his prayer, when people pray toward this place, hear and answer their prayer. So the people who are in the nave, the body of the church, who are facing the altar and are praying toward the altar, they're praying toward Jerusalem. They're praying toward Solomon's temple. And they're doing this to fulfill or to enact Solomon's prayer. But it's more than that. The cathedral itself is supposed to be a picture of Jerusalem. When you look at the book of Revelation and they talk about the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven, what you find it's described in incredibly colorful, beautiful terms. The foundations are all of these different kinds of jewels and things like that. The stained glass windows in these cathedrals are designed so that, generally speaking, the ones facing south are going to be New Testament because that's where most of the light comes from. The one facing north will be Old Testament. But also there'll be a mix of blue and red glass. Blue glass lights up brilliantly in the sunlight. Red glass glows on cloudy days.
Mm.
So no matter when you go in, you are seeing all of these colors. The statuary are painted really gaudy colors. You're seeing these incredible colors in the windows, and the light from the windows shining on the walls, which were whitewashed, they weren't bare stone, is supposed to remind you of the jewels in the book of Revelation. The cathedral is the New Jerusalem, symbolically. Mm-hmm. So the main portal to the west, in every French Gothic cathedral, over the door of the royal portal, the central portal to the west, there's a picture either of Revelation 4, the throne room of heaven, or of Christ seated in judgment. Every one of them. because the west, you see, is pointing toward the sunset. The sunset is the end of the day. Therefore, it is symbolically the end of time.
Right.
And when you are entering the New Jerusalem, you are doing it under the judgment seat of Christ. You are entering eternity there. So the point being, even the compass directions mean something. They have significance. And to the medieval mind, they could look at the world and see it on a multitude of levels simultaneously.
Right.
They would say, you guys are hopelessly one-dimensional. Because that's all we ever see is the surface. And they would see beyond the surface to find meaning. In a lot of ways, there's a lot more wisdom in what they're doing than in what we're doing.
Yeah, for real. Well, the one of the things that got brought up in my mind, I can never remember the scientific term, but it's not particularly, I mean, we're talking about scientific direct fact not even being an issue. So for now, who cares about the exact term? But one of the people, I saw a video, I don't remember exactly where I saw it, but there was a guy talking about, and he's obviously a learned guy, whether it's theologically or something, but he said, this is one of the main reasons, like, I can take the Bible as fact, as absolute truth. And he's doing it from a classical standpoint, you know, whatever. But he says, geologically with the rocks, you know what's significant about the stones in the New Jerusalem, the ones that are the precious stones that are named? Every single one of them it's like anisotropic or something. It's some word. Anyway, he says every single one of them, when you put it in under pure light, essentially you filter the light with a what do you call it? They have some kind of filter. I can't remember the exact situation, but it's a very specific filter to get what they have termed pure light, right? In science. When you look at these various stones, some of them, some of the stones that exist, you know, rubies and diamonds, they look completely clear. They have no color whatsoever in pure light. Every single one of the ones mentioned in Revelation does the exact opposite. They go completely rainbow.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Every single one of the ones mentioned are and they're the most brilliant ones, of course, that go rainbow like that, you know. And it's like there's absolutely no way that they would have known about what we call pure light back then unless they did. Of course, as we know. But like it's like that there's no way that would have been referenced for us, you know, who are this high thinking, you know, academic scientism nonsense, you know, like and so like little things like this throughout the scripture, throughout, you know, our history, our world, they're just these Easter eggs that continue to say, I'm here and I love you, you know.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to say the same in return.
Yeah. It's absolutely true. I mean, the thing that's unique about the scriptures to me is that if you read it superficially, you can think you get it.
You're right.
If you go down an inch, you'll feel like it's about a foot deep. You go down a foot, it's a yard deep. You go down a yard, it's a mile deep. There's really nothing else like it.
Right.
Well, let's get back to the Dark Ages.
Let's do that.
Since we were just talking about cathedrals.
Yeah, sure.
I would ask you to consider a modern office building, or for that matter, a modern church, and compare it to a medieval cathedral or something like that. Something comparable in size, and ask which one is more impressive, which one is more beautiful, which one reflects better the glory of God. The Gothic cathedrals are actually, particularly because they didn't know the math, these things are engineering marvels.
Yes.
You know, and again, trying to reconstruct Notre Dame, the more that they're working on it, the more they're finding just how amazing and kind of complex and difficult it is to do what they did.
Yes.
So these are incredible feats of engineering. And this opens the door to asking the question, what else do you see in the Middle Ages in terms of, advancement, technological or scientific advancement? Well, let's talk about technology first. Vishal Mangalwadi, who is an Indian Christian philosopher, points out that if you compare technologies in China, say, to Europe, the Chinese were producing technological marvels while the Europeans were still flaking stones.
Yes.
Okay. But there's a fundamental difference. When you get to the Middle Ages, there's a fundamental difference in European technology versus Asian technology. In Asia, technologies are developed basically to be playthings for the rich.
Yes.
They're incredible pieces of engineering.
I would argue too that they would have. I would argue too that the other reason, or the other thing you see besides just playthings for the rich, is archival for the rich, scholarly archival, like with paper and that sort of a thing. We do see that, but yeah, you're right. It's all for the rich.
But let's consider that there were monasteries in China, Tibet, and so on that had bookshelves that rotated, so you could move from one book to another. And you would think that would be to make study easier. It wasn't. What they would do is they would put the books on it and they would just rotate it. And the clacking sound as this thing rotated was used as a meditation aid.
Huh.
And then you get the idea like you get with prayer wheels. Prayer wheel has a prayer inscribed on it and you spin it. And that is a way of mechanizing your devotional life. As it turns, every time it turns, that's the equivalent of saying the prayer.
Interesting.
So you don't actually have to be engaged. All you have to do is spin the thing. With the books, you get karma from good karma from interacting with the books. Notice I didn't say reading. You spin the wheel, you get the clacking, you get your meditation and all of that, and you're getting the words being passed over you over and over again. This is not the way the West thinks.
Right.
Mangalwadi points out that the technologies that you see in Europe, for the most part, are technologies that are designed to make the work of the average laborer better. So rather than a sickle, you develop a scythe so that you can mow a field down more effectively.
Right.
You develop horseshoes and horse collars because a horse can pull more weight faster with less feed than an ox. You get water wheels that, the Romans knew about water wheels. They never bothered to put them up because they're expensive and the Romans used slave labor.
Right.
In Europe, they begin putting up water wheels because they say in Genesis, God created human beings to work. God himself is described as a laborer. On the seventh day, he ceased from his labors.
Right.
So work is good, but with the fall, the ground is cursed because of Adam, and work becomes drudgery, it becomes toil, it becomes painful. Well, if Christ came, and so the drudge factor in work is a result of sin.
Right.
But if Christ came to redeem us from the effects of sin, shouldn't that mean that our labor, we should work to make labor more meaningful, to bring the redemption that Christ brought into the world? So they begin putting up water wheels, starting actually in Ireland, as near as I can tell. By the 6th century, they're doing overshot wheels, undershot wheels, tidal wheels, all kinds of things. These spread to England, to the continent. And these are put up primarily by monasteries initially, and then it's picked up by others. What are they doing? Repetitive, mindless work. They're grinding grain. They're fulling cloth, they're sawing timber, they're operating bellows for forges, they're operating trip hammers in smithies, they're fulling cloth. They're doing all of these things to eliminate drudgery.
Yeah.
So you've got all of those things with the water wheel. You've got the agricultural stuff. You've got eyeglasses invented in the 13th century so that monks could continue their labors when their eyes began to fail.
Yeah.
you develop the chimney. The chimney is a medieval invention. The Romans didn't have chimneys.
Mm.
And a chimney will cause a fire to burn more efficiently.
Yeah.
A properly designed chimney. Well, then you start building larger chimneys and attaching bellows to them. And suddenly you go from a very laborious system to extract iron from iron ore. By the 15th century, you've developed the blast furnace, a
Right.
furnace that gets so hot that the iron will melt straight out of it. And then there are other things that you develop from there. I mean, we can go on and on and on. The number of you can talk literally about an industrial revolution in the Middle Ages.
Right.
Does anybody ever talk about this? Not unless you take a medieval economic history class.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, double entry bookkeeping is an invention of the Italians in about the 14th, 15th century. The books of the Italian merchants were so good that you can use modern statistical analyses on them.
And this is one of the reasons why, you know, there are obvious ethical implications with any new technology. Everyone, you know, I get that. And I've even heard you guys talk on podcasts with things where I'm like, yes, I agree. Yes, I don't. Or no, I don't. You know, it just depends. But like with AI and stuff, my thing is like not just AI, but other sorts of technological stuff. I really kind of side with Doug on this with his book Productivity and with Marcus Pittman, who talks about a lot of this kind of stuff. Like we need to figure out as Christians how we can use it and develop it. That's the other thing, develop it in a godly direction. It's not, you know, we can take something that a pagan did and redeem it. Like this is totally doable. But yeah, I'm trying to think like, you know, some of the AI stuff I think still has a sense of what you're talking about, making the laborer's drudgery, you know, easier. But then the other half of it is, you know, Machiavelli. We've kind of mixed the two, and it's like, okay, now we need to figure out, like you were saying with iron ore, we need to figure out how to get the get that medieval part out of the Machiavelli.
Yeah.
So.
I don't think that Christians are spending enough brain power right now thinking through the implications of the various kinds of technologies that are coming down the pike right now.
Oh, for sure.
I don't, you know, I'm currently working on a book with Ken Boa, my mentor and employer, actually, called Flourishing in the New Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're doing is it's going to come out initially as a series of booklets so that we can update them regularly. And then when all of them are done, we'll pull them together and re-edit it as a book.
Right.
But some things are changing so fast that by the time the book is written, the early chapters will be out of date. So we're working it this way. But we started with the low-hanging fruit, you know, the critical theory stuff and stuff coming out of the sexual revolution. But from there, we've got to deal with issues of transhumanism, augmentation versus restoration. From there, we've got to deal with issues of virtual reality, augmented reality. From there, we have to get into AI. And along with all of that, surveillance state stuff, which is the primary application of AI right now.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And you know, all of the and then digital currencies. Most people don't understand a central bank digital currency means that the federal government keeps track of every penny.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And if it decides that it doesn't like what you're saying, it can shut you down.
And that's something that
or if you're buying too much gas or too much meat.
And that's the thing, all these startups immediately bowing to the IRS was like, oh man, we really, like, I don't think people realize how much we lost when Bitcoin and a lot of these others started bowing to the IRS, you know, just on a, hey, don't do that, you know, like nothing else, you know, so.
Yeah. I mean, so all of these things, the technological end of this has got massive worldview implications. It's got massive practical implications for how we live. It's got massive implications for the church.
That's fantastic.
And we just are not dealing with this.
Yeah. Well, everyone who's listening, start thinking about it, right? Maybe we'll figure something out. But study your scripture. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I'm going to tell you one thing after I sign off before you leave. If you have just a second, I won't spend a ton of time on it. Everybody, remember, be your family's bard. Do not turn to the right or to the left, and the Lord will be with you wherever you go. Join us next time in the trenches on Poets at War.
God of song said the warrior bard, though all the world betray thee, one sword at least thy right shall guard, one faithful heart shall praise thee.
If these words awoke within you a stirring and radiant fire, please remember even a bard is worthy of his wages and hire. Go to joshuadavidling.com/support to support me and my family.